The house that held my history. I've lived in this house for 34 years. It's not just bricks and wood. It's my history. My bones are in the floorboards. My husband's laughter is still caught between the walls. And every window, every creaking step, holds the sound of my children's footsteps when they were still small and sweet and called me mommy. We moved in when I was just 26. Back then we had nothing. My husband, George, was a machinist. Strong hands, big dreams. I was working night shifts at the hospital, juggling diapers and double shifts. But this house was our dream. We bought it with hope, not money. The kitchen had yellow wallpaper peeling off the edges, and the bathtub squeaked when you filled it. But we were proud. It was ours. I remember painting the nursery in soft blue before our first child was born. I remember the Christmas mornings when the kids would race down the stairs, half asleep and glowing with joy. I remember George fixing the garage door at midnight because the cold would freeze it shut. We planted tomatoes every spring and argued about whether the fence needed replacing. And we danced in the living room once. No music, just the sound of rain outside. Then George died. A drunk driver ran a red light on 8 Mile Road. I was 45 with 2 kids still in school and a mortgage half paid. I could have lost it all, but I didn't. I worked every overtime shift the hospital offered. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, all to keep this house standing. My hands gave out before my will ever did. So when people look at this house and see a place to flip or sell, I want to scream. This isn't just property. It's sacred. It's where my entire life happened. That's why when my son and his wife started asking about the deed, I felt something inside me begin to tremble. Not out of fear, out of grief. Because when someone you love starts looking at your life like it's a transaction, something to be signed away, you start to realize, maybe they don't see you anymore. And that's the cruelest kind of loneliness. To live in a house full of people and still feel invisible. I never meant for them to stay. Mark, my only son, had called me one cold January evening, his voice cracked with frustration. He said things had gotten tight. Jenna had lost her job at the firm, and daycare was bleeding them dry. Their lease was up. They needed a place to stay, just for a while, he promised. And I said yes. Of course I did. I was his mother. And mothers don't measure love in months or rent checks. They just open the door. So I made room. I cleared out the guest bedroom for them and shifted things in the attic to make space for the kids' toys. I let them change the curtains, repaint the hallway, replace my old coffee table. It felt like small things at first, little harmless adjustments to help them feel at home. But somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like my home. They brought in their own furniture. My favorite chair, the one George gave me for our 10th anniversary, got pushed into the basement without asking. Jenna reorganized the kitchen. Mark installed a password on the Wi-Fi without telling me. They started referring to the guest room as the boys' room and mine as Grandma's side. Funny, isn't it? I never asked them to pay rent, but somehow they began acting like landlords. They said it was just more efficient to put the bills in Mark's name. Jenna started complaining that I kept the heat too high, that I used the wrong kind of detergent for the kids' clothes. Every part of my routine became something to adjust or monitor. I even caught Jenna whispering to a friend on the phone. She's sweet, but she's starting to lose it, I think. You know how old people get. I wasn't losing it. I was watching it slip away. There were nights when I sat alone in the kitchen while they laughed together in the living room with the door shut. Holidays felt like I was intruding on my own traditions. They would host dinners, invite friends over, and I would be told afterward, "Oh, we thought you were resting." No one ever asked how I felt. No one ever said, "Thank you for letting us stay." It was as if the moment I gave them space, they decided it had always belonged to them. And through it all, I kept quiet. I made tea, folded laundry, picked the kids up from school when needed. I told myself this was temporary. That love meant sacrifice. That one day they'd remember the hands that held them. But the truth was starting to bloom like mold in the corners. They weren't guests anymore. They were settlers. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing about erosion. It's quiet. Jenna started with little sighs when I spoke, rolling her eyes when I forgot where I left the keys, telling the kids to be patient with Grandma. She's getting forgetful. I wasn't forgetful. I was tired. Tired of being treated like a burden. Mark changed too. My sweet boy, the one who used to crawl into bed after nightmares, now barely looked me in the eye. He only spoke to me when something needed fixing or the kids needed watching. And even then, it felt like a transaction. The grandchildren, my own flesh and blood, began copying their parents. Grandma's weird, I overheard once. They'd pull their plates away if I sat beside them. One even asked if I was going to die soon. No one corrected them. They had slowly rewritten my place in this house. I wasn't the woman who built it, sacrificed for it, poured my life into its walls. I was just the old lady down the hall. Sometimes I'd knock on the door of my own kitchen before entering, or wait for them to finish dinner before I made myself a sandwich. It wasn't my home anymore. It was their stage. I was just the silent backdrop. I stopped opening the blinds, stopped answering calls from old friends. I didn't want to explain what was happening, because deep down, I couldn't believe it myself. I went from being a mother to being tolerated, from being the provider to the afterthought. And when you live like that long enough, something inside you starts to go quiet. Not dead. Just waiting. It was a Tuesday night. Dinner was quiet, like most nights now. The clinking of forks, the low hum of the television in the background. The kids were glued to their tablets. Jenna was scrolling through her phone. Mark was staring at his plate. Then, without warning, Jenna looked up and said, "So, have you given any more thought to putting the house in our name?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at Mark, hoping he'd stop her. He didn't. She went on casually like she was asking about the weather. "We've been looking at refinance options. If the deed's in our name, we can actually do something with this place. Make it modern. Better for the kids." I set my fork down. "This is my home," I said calmly. "Your father and I." She cut me off. "And we're your family. Don't you trust us?" I didn't respond. Because I didn't know how to say, I used to. Then came the explosion. "Fine," she snapped, pushing her chair back. "Just lie there and rot then. You know what? You dying would actually make things easier. At least we'd get the damn house." Mark didn't say a word. Not a protest. Not even a glance my way. The children kept eating like nothing happened. I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't cry. Not in front of them. I sat perfectly still like furniture. Like a thing that could no longer feel. Later, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence around me screaming louder than her words. That night, something in me shifted. Not out of rage. Not out of revenge. Out of heartbreak. Because now, it was no longer a question of when they'd take the house. It was only a matter of how long I'd keep standing in their way. And for the first time I knew. I had to leave before they buried me here. I didn't move. Not when she said it. Not when she pushed her chair back and stormed down the hallway. Not even when Mark got up quietly and followed her like a shadow. I just sat there. My hands were resting in my lap. My plate untouched. The steam from my tea had gone cold. The kitchen light buzzed softly above me, and the clock ticked louder than it ever had. You dying would actually make things easier. The words didn't echo. They carved. I stared at the wall in front of me, the one I had painted with George, a warm beige he thought was too plain, but we laughed about it. There were still faint marks where the kids had drawn stick figures in crayon. I'd never scrubbed them off completely. Now I stared at it like I was staring through a window. Not a wall. A window out of my life. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was numb. It wasn't just the cruelty of the words. It was who said them. And who didn't stop them. Mark had always been quiet. But that night, his silence didn't feel like discomfort. It felt like consent. The woman he chose, the mother of his children, had just told me to die to make their lives easier. And he let her. That was the moment I realized. I wasn't their mother anymore. I was an obstacle. I don't remember how long I sat there. The house had gone quiet. The kids were upstairs, probably playing. No one came back to check on me. Not even out of guilt. And I stayed in that chair until the moonlight crept across the floor. Until the ache in my back reminded me I was still in a body. Until the tears came, slowly, silently, sliding down my cheeks like they were afraid to disturb the quiet. I didn't sob. I didn't wail. I just leaked. Like something broken. Because in that moment, I didn't feel like a person. I felt like something that had already been buried and forgotten. The next morning, nothing had changed. Not for them. Jenna hummed as she made pancakes. The kids argued over cereal. Mark scrolled through his phone, sipping coffee like he hadn't just watched his wife wish me dead. No apology. No acknowledgement. Not even a glance. I moved around the kitchen like a shadow. I cleaned the dishes, wiped down the counters, poured myself a cup of lukewarm coffee and sat quietly in the corner like I had no right to the table anymore. They didn't speak to me, and I didn't have the strength to speak to them. The days blurred together. One bled into the next. I lost track of time. Morning light, evening dark. None of it mattered. The routines continued around me, but I wasn't part of them. It was like being in a house with strangers who looked like people I used to love. Sometimes I'd hear them whispering behind closed doors. Snippets. Enough to slice. She's being difficult again. She's stubborn. Old people get paranoid. She probably forgot half of what was said anyway. I didn't forget. I remembered every word. I became an invisible presence in my own home. I'd hear my name, not in conversation, but in complaint. When I walked into a room, silence followed. When I spoke, no one responded. Even the children treated me like clutter, stepping around me, ignoring me unless I had food in my hands. One afternoon, the youngest asked Jenna why I didn't live in one of those places with the other old people. Jenna didn't correct her. She just said, maybe someday. I stopped eating at the dinner table. I started keeping food in my room. Crackers, fruit, a thermos of tea. It was easier than pretending I was welcome. Some nights, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, heart pounding, thoughts racing. Not from fear, but from the aching truth. I was no longer a part of this family. I was something they were trying to outlast. I thought about leaving every day that week. Not in a dramatic way. I didn't pack a suitcase or slam any doors. It was quieter than that. A kind of internal shifting, like a room slowly emptying itself, drawer by drawer, until only the shell remains. Each morning, I sat by the bedroom window with a cup of tea that grew cold in my hands. I looked at the garden George and I had built together, now trampled by bikes, toys, and neglect. They had let the soil go dry, let the ivy overgrow the fence. The tomatoes we once tended together had long stopped growing. Just like us. I kept asking myself, where would I go? And then one afternoon, while folding laundry that wasn't mine, the answer came. So simple, it almost embarrassed me. Martha. My college roommate. My best friend through thick and thin. We lost touch a bit after her husband passed. She'd moved to a small place outside of Dearborn. Sent a Christmas card every year, always signed. Come visit, there's always a bed for you. I hadn't called her in over a year. But I did now. The phone rang twice. Is this a ghost I'm hearing? She laughed, voice warm and real, so different from the cold silence I'd grown used to. I didn't say much. Just that I needed to talk. That I needed her. She didn't ask questions. She just said, come tomorrow. I'll have coffee ready. Martha hadn't changed much. Same messy bun. Same sharp eyes. Same ability to know when something was wrong without needing to be told. I sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the smell of cinnamon and old books, and told her everything. Every word. Every look. Every silence. I didn't cry this time. I just spoke. When I finished, she was quiet. She reached over and held my hand, not gently, but firmly. The kind of grip that reminds you you're still here. You don't owe them your life, she said. Or your house. And something inside me, something I thought had long turned to ash, sparked. That night, I sat alone in Martha's garden. The wind was cold, but I didn't shiver. I remembered George's voice. Not a memory, but a feeling, like the echo of someone standing just behind me. Don't ever let them take from you what we built together. He had said it when we paid off the last of the mortgage. We stood in the doorway, arms around each other, soaked from the rain, laughing like fools. It was ours. Every inch. Now I saw it clearly. They weren't just taking the house. They were trying to erase me from my own story. And I couldn't let them. I didn't need revenge. I needed release. That was the night I made my decision. I returned to the house the next morning without a word. They didn't even notice I'd been gone. Jenna was on the phone. Mark was in the garage. The kids were glued to a screen, as usual. I walked past them, slow and quiet, like a ghost retracing the steps of its former life. But I wasn't a ghost. Not anymore. I went straight to my room, closed the door, and pulled out the old fireproof box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were the deed, the original mortgage papers, George's will, and a copy of the letter he wrote me before his surgery, the one he didn't come back from. His handwriting was still as steady as I remembered. If anything happens to me, promise me you'll keep the house safe. I don't care what happens to the furniture or the fence or the stupid broken sink. Just keep it safe. Don't let anyone shame you out of it. This house is you. I placed the letter on the bed. Let it sit beside me. Let it speak louder than their insults ever did. That afternoon, I walked to the backyard. The wind was crisp, carrying the first hints of fall. The same tree George had planted our first year in the house stood tall, its leaves golden, some already letting go. I stood beneath it and whispered, "They want me dead to get this house. But I won't die for them. I'll live somewhere else. And I'll take my dignity with me." And for the first time in years, I felt still. Not trapped. Still. Like a pond without ripples. Like a woman who had stopped apologizing for existing. That night, I didn't cry. I packed one suitcase. Just enough to start again. And I left the rest, the resentment, the waiting, the silence, exactly where it belonged. The next day, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Martha. "I'm ready," I told her. There was no need to explain what that meant. She simply said, "Good. I'll make up the guest room." The second call was to an attorney. Not someone fancy. Just a quiet man named Mr. Klein, whose office sat above a local bakery. He specialized in property law and didn't ask too many questions. That's what I needed. Someone who could help me leave without fanfare. Without confrontation. I told him everything. About the deed, the verbal abuse, the threat. His eyes didn't widen. He'd heard worse. That somehow made it worse. He said, "Legally, you have every right. But emotionally, you need to be sure." I nodded. I am. The house wasn't just bricks. It was memory. But memories don't have to be entombed in resentment. I didn't want Mark and Jenna to have it, not because I wanted to punish them, but because they hadn't earned it. They had poisoned it with entitlement, turned love into leverage. If they had asked with kindness, I might have said yes. But they demanded with cruelty. So I found someone else. Her name was Elena. We met through my church. She was a single mother of 3 new to this country, working 2 jobs, living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment downtown. Her children were soft-spoken, polite, and wide-eyed every time I brought cookies to Sunday school. When I told her I wanted to speak privately, she looked nervous. "I'm not asking for help," I said. "I'm offering it." I told her about the house. I told her I was leaving it. And I wanted her to have it for a symbolic $1. She cried. Not out of disbelief, but out of understanding. Because she, too, had known what it felt like to be unseen. To be treated as disposable. "I will take care of it," she whispered. "I will make it a real home again." That's all I needed. The paperwork was quick. Cleaner than I expected. A notary came to the house while Mark was at work. Jenna was out with the kids. I signed the transfer, slipped the keys into a small white envelope. Then I walked to the mailbox, placed it inside, and added a single note. "You waited for me to die. I'm sorry to disappoint you. But you'll have to rent now, from strangers." And I meant every word. Elena brought her children with her when they came to see the house. They didn't walk. They tiptoed. Like they were entering a cathedral. Her oldest, Matteo, looked around in silent awe. Her daughter, Lucia, clutched Elena's hand tightly but kept peeking into every room like she couldn't believe they were real. And the youngest, Tomas, gasped out loud when he saw the backyard. "Mommy, it has a tree. A single tree. The same tree Mark once said was a pain to rake." Elena apologized for their excitement, but I told her, "You don't have to apologize for joy." We walked through each room. I told them stories, where George used to sit, the creaky step we never fixed, the window that glowed gold every evening at 5. The kids listened like I was telling a fairy tale. But to me, this wasn't a storybook. It was a handoff. A legacy. Elena ran her fingers across the banister like it was a relic. I used to dream of a house like this, she said. Back in Honduras, we lived in a cement block with no roof. When it rained, we stayed awake in the dark, listening to water hit tin pans. She turned to me, eyes full but steady. Why are you doing this? I didn't know how to answer at first. How do you explain the difference between blood and love? But I tried. Because you'll love this house. Not own it. Love it. And that's all I ever wanted. Someone who wouldn't look at it like a prize, or a burden, or a bargaining chip. Just someone who sees it. Filled her eyes. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded bill. $1. She handed it to me with both hands. It was the most sacred transaction I'd ever made. The kids danced in the hallway while she signed the paperwork. I gave them the keys, and they asked if they could each pick a room. I laughed, genuinely, for the first time in months. Before I left, Elena placed her hand on my arm and said, "You won't regret this." I already didn't. Because in the warmth of their excitement, in the way they touched every doorknob and floorboard with reverence, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Home. Not entitlement. Not expectation. Not greed. Just home. The final papers were signed on a Friday morning. Mr. Klein came by with a briefcase and a notary. Elena wore a navy blouse and fixed her hair back in a bun. Her children sat on the couch, holding their breath, as if they knew this moment would shape everything that came after. I signed each line slowly, deliberately, like I was undoing a knot that had choked me for years. Seller, Margaret E. Lawson. Buyer, Elena Martinez. Sale price, $1. No hesitation. No regrets. When I pressed the pen down for the final signature, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like release. I packed that same night. 1 suitcase, 1 box. A few clothes, George's letter, old photos, and my wedding ring, which I hadn't worn in years but suddenly couldn't bear to leave behind. The rest? I let it go. I left the furniture, the dishes, the family portraits on the walls. Let them haunt whoever walked through that door next. I wasn't taking ghosts with me. Before dawn, I stood one last time in the hallway. The house was silent, but not heavy. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a prison. It felt ready. I left the keys in a white envelope on the counter. On top of it, a note, short and sharp, like the blade they'd been holding to my dignity for months. To those who wish me gone. I've gone, but not the way you hoped. The house is no longer yours to inherit. You'll need to ask the new owners if they're willing to rent. I didn't sign it. They'd know. By the time they came home that afternoon, I was already gone. So was the deed. So was the control. I imagine it took them a moment to understand. Maybe they thought it was a joke. Maybe they called a lawyer in a panic. Maybe they screamed. Maybe they went quiet. I don't know. I don't care. I didn't stick around for their reaction. Because this wasn't for them. This was for me. For the woman who had spent years being erased. For the mother who had been told to die. For the wife who had once built a home from nothing, and finally, gave it to someone who saw its worth. I left before sunrise. No goodbyes. No confrontation. Just a soft pull of the front door, one last glance at the porch steps George had sanded himself, and then silence. The streets of Detroit were still asleep. The sky was pale gray, like it hadn't yet decided whether to storm or shine. I didn't wait to find out. Martha was waiting with the engine running. She didn't ask questions. She didn't say, "Are you sure?" She just looked at me, saw the weight I'd laid down, and nodded once. We drove away, and I didn't look back. I imagine the chaos began around 4:30 p.m. That's when Jenna usually picked up the kids and came home, already irritated, already barking orders. Mark would have followed later, briefcase in hand, expecting dinner or quiet or control, none of which would be there anymore. I imagine they found the envelope. Opened it. Read the note once. Then again. Then louder. I imagine Jenna's face contorting in disbelief. her voice rising, eyes darting to the front door like I might walk back through it and undo it all. But I wouldn't. I imagine the calls came next. To Mark's friends. To lawyers. Maybe even to my phone. But by then, the number had already been disconnected. My name was no longer tied to the property. My bank accounts were moved. I had become, in every practical way, untouchable. They had always counted on time, on my passivity, on the assumption that I would outlive usefulness, but not outlive them. What they didn't count on was me choosing to disappear on my own terms. Martha's home was small, but warm. She gave me the back bedroom, a shelf for my books, a pair of slippers. She made chamomile tea every night, and we sat on the porch watching the world move without urgency. It was strange at first, to not be needed. But then I realized I had mistaken being used for being needed. Here, no one interrupted me. No one belittled me. No one watched me waiting for me to die. Here, I was just Margaret. Not grandma, not burden, not stepping stone. Just me. I don't know what happened to them after that. I know they didn't reach Elena. She changed the locks the day she moved in. I know the utilities got cut off for a few days. Everything was still in Mark's name. I know they had to move. Probably somewhere smaller. Somewhere with no backyard tree. No window that glowed golden at 5. But what I know most is this. They still don't understand what they lost. And they never will. Because when someone sees you as a transaction, they don't mourn your absence. They just scramble to fill the void you left with control, money, noise. But I didn't leave a void. I took everything that mattered with me. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the cold kind I had grown used to. The silence laced with tension, with glances that cut and words that never came. This was different. This silence was clean, gentle. The kind that wrapped around me like a blanket rather than closing in like a coffin. Martha's home was small, but every inch had been touched by love. Mismatched chairs. A chipped mug she refused to throw out. Plants that leaned toward the sun because they were never forgotten. I hadn't realized how loud survival had been until I no longer had to do it. The first night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was uncomfortable, but because for the first time in years, I was safe, and my body didn't know how to rest in peace. I lay awake listening to the hum of the heater, the rustle of wind through old trees, the sound of my own breathing. It struck me that I hadn't truly heard myself breathe in years. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and walked into the kitchen to find Martha humming softly, flipping pancakes. "You look lighter," she said. I hadn't even spoken yet. But somehow, she could see it, the weight that had been lifted, even if it still lingered around the edges of my eyes. We settled into a rhythm. We gardened together, not for food, but for joy. Martha gave me a pair of gloves, and I spent my afternoons planting lavender and rosemary. The soil was soft, and so was I, in ways I had forgotten I could be. We played cards at night, watched old movies in our robes, talked about everything and nothing. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. We didn't need to, because there was no one to prove anything to, no one to walk on eggshells around, no one to ask for permission to exist. I started writing again, just a few lines at first, things I hadn't dared say aloud, like, "I miss who I used to be before I was someone else's convenience." Kindness is not weakness, but I mistook silence for peace. One morning, I walked past a mirror and didn't flinch. I stopped, looked, really looked. There were still lines, still sagging skin and tired eyes. But behind them was someone alive, someone I thought they'd buried under guilt and obligation. Someone who was never dead, just waiting to be remembered. The rumors started about 2 weeks after I left. Martha heard it first, at church. A neighbor leaned over after the sermon and whispered, "Did you hear about Margaret Lawson? Gave away her house for $1." Martha just nodded, her lips tight. She didn't offer details. She didn't need to. The story spread like spilled coffee, fast, messy, and always missing the truth. Some said I'd lost my mind. Others said I was manipulated. One woman claimed she heard I was in the early stages of dementia and had been taken advantage of by some foreign family. No one called to ask me. No one asked why. They preferred the version where I was either a fool or a tragedy, never a woman who chose. Mark didn't speak to anyone directly, but the silence was loud. He stopped going to the community softball games. Jenna quit her part-time work at the local dental office, or maybe they let her go. Her face didn't wear embarrassment well, from what I heard. She was too used to being the one in control of the narrative. One of my old neighbors, Rita, did call Martha. "I just can't believe she would do something like that," she said. To her own son. Martha's answer was simple. Believe it. And maybe ask why she had to. That was the first time I truly realized how much the world expects mothers to endure anything, swallow anything, be grateful for abuse, as long as it's wrapped in the ribbon of family. But I wasn't grateful. I was awake. The whispers didn't stop. They just faded, replaced by newer gossip, fresher scandals. Still, my name lingered in certain places like a ghost. At the grocery store, in the pews, in the aching pauses of conversations between people who used to say they knew me. But I didn't care. Because for the first time, I wasn't performing. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. Not for the years I stayed. Not for the day I left. Not for the dollar that bought someone else's dream and purchased my freedom. They could twist the story all they wanted. Let them make me the villain. Let them say I snapped. It didn't matter. Because I knew the truth. They didn't lose a house. They lost a woman who had given them everything, and then finally, gave herself a way out. They tried to find me. I knew they would. The day the keys changed hands, Mark must have stood in the front yard, holding the letter with shaking hands, reading it again and again like it might rewrite itself if he stared hard enough. But the number he dialed didn't ring. It didn't even go to voicemail. It simply said, "This number has been disconnected." Jenna called too, probably more times, probably louder. I imagine her pacing the kitchen, teeth clenched, spitting words like betrayal, manipulation, theft. But there was no one left on the line to hear it. They emailed once. The subject line read, "You can't be serious." I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew what was inside. Gaslight wrapped in guilt, sentences designed to drag me back into submission. Please disguised as blame. I didn't reply. I never would. Because when you spend years being told you're dramatic, sensitive, confused, when your memories are questioned and your pain reworded to fit someone else's comfort, you learn that silence is not just peace. It's power. They tried reaching out through people I hadn't spoken to in months. A cousin. A neighbor. Even an old friend of George's. Just let her know we're willing to talk. We didn't mean it like that. It's still her family, but they weren't my family anymore. Not in the ways that matter. And I didn't leave room for bridges to be rebuilt, because I'd spent too long patching the holes in ones they kept burning. Elena told me later, through a quiet call, that they had come by the house once. They rang the bell. Waited. Knocked. Waited longer. But she didn't open the door. They looked through the front window like they were trying to see the past. But it was gone. Painted over. Given to someone new. She said Jenna stood there, arms crossed, face tight. Mark looked older, thinner. Not like a man grieving a mother. Like a man shocked that the consequences had finally arrived. They left without a word. Sometimes people ask me if I miss them. No. Because missing someone requires memory to be sweet. And theirs had turned bitter long before I walked away. What I miss is the boy I once raised. The son who used to hold my hand crossing the street. The man who used to hug me when he was proud of something, or needed reassurance he still mattered. But that man disappeared long ago. And I stopped trying to resurrect him. Because sometimes, you don't lose people. They just show you who they've been all along. By the third week, I had become a conversation. Not a person, a subject. A story passed from one front porch to the next, one church pew to another, folded into casual gossip like a cautionary tale. Did you hear what she did? To her own son. I heard she gave it to strangers. Some said I was losing it. Others said I was just bitter. The most generous said I must have been pushed too far, though they never asked what too far looked like. But none of them knew the truth. Because none of them had ever stood in their own kitchen, heart cracked open, while their daughter-in-law screamed they were worth more dead. None of them had ever been erased so slowly they started to wonder if they'd ever existed in the first place. One afternoon, Martha and I went to the market together. I caught the sideways glances, the tight smiles, the way one woman nudged another when I walked past the flower stall. Two women from the church turned their backs as I approached the produce table, pretending to rearrange apples that didn't need rearranging. They didn't say it aloud, but their eyes did. How could you? I smiled anyway, picked my oranges, paid in cash, walked away without flinching. Let them wonder. Let them build their stories out of the scraps I left behind. Because for once, I wasn't hungry for approval. A week later, I received a letter. Handwritten. No return address. It was from a woman I barely knew, someone from my church days, long ago. It said, I don't know the whole story, but I just want you to know. I see you. I believe you. And I wish I had done the same when my own daughter called me a burden. That letter sat on my nightstand for days. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because the truth didn't need defending anymore. It just needed to live. I no longer filled rooms with explanations. I no longer corrected rumors. I let people say what they needed to say to sleep at night. Because I finally understood, their comfort was never my responsibility. Their version of me was never my job to fix. And the ones who mattered wouldn't ask why I left. They'd ask why I stayed so long. I didn't write it to send it. I wrote it because there were things inside me that had never been said, not to them, not even to myself. Words that had curdled in my chest for years, waiting for a safe place to land. So I opened a blank page in an old journal, took a deep breath, and began. Dear Mark, you used to be my whole world. When you were born, I held you so tightly I was afraid you might disappear. You had your father's hands. You cried louder than any baby on the floor. And even then I remember thinking, he will move mountains. And I'll be behind him, carrying water if I have to. I gave you everything. Not because I expected repayment, but because I believed love, real love, didn't need to be measured. I don't know when you stopped seeing me as a person. Maybe it was the day you got married. Maybe it was the first time you watched your wife talk over me and said nothing. Or maybe it happened slowly, like rust, quiet, until everything collapsed under the weight of what you wouldn't admit. I tried to stay. Tried to make peace with being reduced, erased, dismissed. I told myself it was worth it, to be near you, to help with the kids, to keep the family together. But families don't grow in places poisoned by entitlement. And love is not loyalty to cruelty. That night, when she told me to die, you didn't even flinch. You looked at your plate. Like I was just background noise. Like my death would have been a relief. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I simply remembered who I was before motherhood swallowed my name. And I walked away. I don't write this to hurt you. I write this to bury the version of me who waited for you to love her again. She's gone now. And in her place is a woman who remembers her worth. I hope one day your children will treat you with more care than you gave me. I hope if you hear this story from someone else's lips, you'll recognize the ending. Because it didn't have to end this way. But you chose silence. And I chose myself. Goodbye, Mom. I tore the letter from the journal, folded it gently, slipped it into an envelope and tucked it inside my drawer. Not to be mailed. Not to be found. Just to be written. Because sometimes, you don't need to speak the truth aloud to be free. You just need to stop pretending it didn't exist. I hadn't visited George's grave in over a year. Not because I didn't care, but because I hadn't had anything to say. For the longest time, my grief had turned into something hollow. A routine. Fresh flowers. A few minutes of silence. Then back home to a house that didn't feel like ours anymore. But now, with everything behind me, I needed to see him. Not to mourn. To remember. It was a mild Sunday. The kind of weather George used to call funeral sunshine. Gentle light, still air, quiet skies. I drove out alone. No GPS. I didn't need one. I could find his plot blindfolded if I had to. I brought marigolds. He used to hate roses. Said they tried too hard. The headstone was simple. George Lawson, 1952 to 2005. Beloved husband, father, friend. I knelt, brushed off some leaves, and sat cross-legged beside him. And I talked. I did it, George. I let it go. I let them go. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't tremble. There were no tears. You were right, they didn't deserve what we built. But I didn't know how to walk away. I thought if I just kept giving, they'd remember who I was. They didn't. I looked out at the grass beyond the stones, calm, still, endless. But I remembered. I remembered me. And I gave the house to someone who sees it. Really sees it. Just like you saw me, all those years. I closed my eyes and let the wind move through me. And I pictured us, younger, louder, dancing in the living room with the radio playing too low to hear. I saw him fixing the sink again, swearing under his breath. Saw him holding Mark as a baby, whispering promises he meant with his whole soul. I remembered the first night we slept on the floor of that house, eating Chinese takeout from the carton, laughing about the noise the pipes made. And I whispered, "It's not theirs anymore, George." And neither am I. When I stood to leave, something inside me felt lighter. Not like closure exactly. More like permission. To keep living. To build again. Not from scratch. From truth. I didn't plan on starting over. At 60, starting over sounds like something reserved for people with bigger bank accounts or fewer wrinkles. But I wasn't starting over in the way people imagine, with new cities, new careers, or reckless reinvention. I was starting over quietly, slowly, with a cup of tea that I poured for myself, with a chair in the sun I didn't have to fight for, with mornings that didn't begin in service to anyone else's comfort. I had space now, to exist, to think, to heal. Martha brought me a stack of empty canvases one morning. "I found these in the attic," she said. "You used to paint, didn't you?" I hadn't touched a brush in decades, but I picked one up anyway. My first painting was rough, a mess of blues and grays, like weather trapped on canvas. But it was mine. Unapologetically. Imperfectly. Mine. By the third painting, I started to see color again, not just in the art, but in myself. I painted our old tree, the one George planted. I didn't know I remembered it so vividly until I saw it take shape beneath my hand. I joined a book club at the local library, not because I wanted to discuss themes or plot, but because I wanted to be in a room where no one expected me to serve coffee or babysit or explain myself. I made new friends. People who knew me only as Margaret, not mom, not grandma, not someone's support system. Just a woman with good taste in mysteries and strong opinions about scones. And for the first time I felt known. Not needed. Known. One morning I wrote in my journal. They told me to die. And in some ways I did. But not the way they meant. I buried the woman who gave until she vanished. And I planted someone else in her place. Someone who blooms. It's strange what stays with you. The smell of your child's hair when they're small. The warmth of your husband's laugh through a closed bathroom door. The shape of sunlight on a kitchen floor in late autumn. But it's also strange what you let go of. I no longer remember the exact tone of Jenna's voice when she told me to die, but I remember how quiet the world felt afterward. Like it had paused, waiting to see what I would do next. And I'm proud of what I did. Not because it was dramatic. Not because it was clever. But because it was mine. The house still stands. I pass it sometimes from a distance. The shutters are a different color now. There are toys on the front lawn, not ones I bought. The garden is thriving. Someone added a swing to the tree. And inside that house, I imagine there's laughter again. Not mine. But that's okay. Because my story didn't end when I walked out that door. It began. So if you ask me now, do you regret it? I'll say, no. Do you miss them? I'll say, not the way they were. Was it hard? Yes. But so is being erased. And if you ask me what I learned from it all, I'll say this. You are allowed to leave what wounds you. Even if it shares your blood. Even if it calls you mom. Even if the world calls it love. Because sometimes, they tell you to die. And what they don't realize is that's exactly what it takes to finally start living.